I'd like to introduce you to our speakers for today. As the Director of Engineering at Yahara Software, Josh brings over 20 years of industry experience to the table. Throughout his journey, he's had the opportunity to work with a diverse array of companies, from nimble startups to large corporations, gaining a broad perspective on engineering challenges and solutions. Josh is passionate about the transformative power of data, and is always eager to leverage it to drive innovation and impact. Joining Josh, we've got James Magala, Yahara's own bioinformatics practice manager, who brings a unique combination of wet lab expertise and software development. From designing assays like PCR and DNA sequencing to building globally used software tools for data analysis, James is all about streamlining and improving lab processes. And last but not least, we've got Adam Steinert, Chief Technology Officer at Yahara Software. Adam blends a background in biology with deep expertise in software engineering. He has led the development of commercial solutions in bioinformatics, scientific instrumentation, and software products across biohealth, telematics, and service automation. Adam is also advancing the integration of AI, machine learning, and large language models into scientific operations, driving innovation and impact for Yahara's clients. Alrighty, fellas, the floor is yours.
Ray, thank you so much for the intro to the audience. Welcome. We are so glad to have you with us today. We've got a little bit of a different flavor for you. We've got a set of technologies that you may not have heard that much about, at least in this industry. These are mature technologies that are used extensively in a number of other industries, and we think there's some really cool applications here in the laboratory space. So we're going to start a conversation today about digital twins. To lead us off a little bit, I'm going to ask Adam to give us just a little bit of an intro about digital twins. We're going to open the floor and just discuss among ourselves, and we would love to hear from you about applications, interesting ideas, or questions that you've got as we go along. We'll leave just a minute for some Q&A at the end, but we'll take questions all the way through. With that, Adam, why don't you give us just the 1 minute intro? What the heck is a digital twin anyway?
It is always a good question because it seems like everybody we talk to, has varying concepts there. But for our purposes today, we'll talk about the basic, digital twin being some physical or some digital representation of a physical object that has varying degrees of interactivity to it. That you can, use it to sort of reflect the current state of a physical object, use it as a stand-in if one of those is not available. So say you've got, some representation of an instrument, it might be using it to interact with it, maybe in a digital world in VR or AR to actually control, the physical instrument. And like, again, the complexity there can vary, and that's something I think we'll talk about a little bit more there. I mean, these can range from anything from like, a simple simple application to use as a stand-in, say, as you're developing a new instrument, a simulator, all the way to some complex orchestration of many digital twins to represent like an entire supply chain. Another one that's popped up a lot, at least a little bit that I've heard recently are people kind of taking that digital twin idea as sort of like their AI representation of themselves, right? I feed in, a bunch of information myself to to an LLM or some sort of AI and get, sort of like that feedback of interacting with a person. So like I said, there's a lot of different capacities that the digital twins can operate in. And so I'm hoping today that, we can explore a little bit, about sort of, again, the basis of what they are and specifically how they can be used in laboratories and lab operations to enhance workflows, to make us more productive. And as we talk about sort of like the context of existing industries and how they're being used, how that extrapolates to labs, and then what the future looks like. Like like to end our discussion talking about a little bit of the future innovation that's possible that we're seeing and that we're excited about. I guess for everybody that's joining us today, this is a fairly common conversation that some James, Josh, myself get together and geek out about these things. So this is a little bit of what goes on Slack and in our day-to-day conversations to some degree. But so I guess, having said all that, as I tend to go on about these things, maybe for you, James, we've got this sort of idea of like, digital twins are out there. They're used in a lot of different industries. And, I think the lab space is actually an area where we don't see quite as much of that innovation being applied. Why is that?
I think the lab space it's a relatively fast space for technological advancement in terms of the instrumentation. Because as a scientist, you're driven to get to the data, you want the best results, and so you're willing to invest in your laboratory infrastructure. It's one of the slowest spaces to innovate in terms of software. There is so much custom stuff that's going on in each individual laboratory that you really don't see a large amount of nicely standardized software that works well across the entire industry. And so, because it's traditionally been a hard place to get going with software, a lot of the software innovation has happened in some other industry, has happened somewhere else, and then gradually filters into the laboratory space. I think digital twins fall in that category. The funny thing here is the the reason that you would want any of these digital twins is that you can start to model out how your instrumentation is behaving and then use that as sort of the stand-in that you mentioned to develop another piece of software against, to overlay control algorithms on it, or to model what's going on in the laboratory and expose it so you can see it outside of the laboratory. There's a lot of opportunity here. This is actually a really, really great entry point for how do you start to digitize some of what's going on in your laboratory space. But again, it's just been a slow industry in terms of adopting the latest, greatest piece of software, and we're depending on the innovation to happen somewhere else. So this is now us starting to talk about, let's bring it in a little bit.
Yeah, so I think that's well said. There's a comment in chat asking to define digital twins. So I don't know if maybe Tag came in a little bit late, or perhaps we didn't fully kind of capture it. So I guess to that question, maybe we could do two things. Just succinctly, say a digital twin is a stand-in for an object, a physical object. It might be an instrument, a system, a supply chain, but it's essentially a representation of that physical entity that can be interacted with. We actually do have a couple examples of things that we've done in-house. Maybe now might be a good opportunity to maybe to show some of that off, to just kind of describe that in in some concrete terms. And maybe we'll start off with this example that we did of a pipetting robot that we created this representation using the Unity game engine as sort of a lower fidelity physical representation of a real type of instrument and how it can interact. And so what you see here, this animation, is actually the a program that's being fed into it, and the game object is actually responding as the actual instrument would to those commands coming in, so that you can see get a an understanding of what's going on. And I think, this we found these types of applications to be useful, I guess, in a couple things. Number one, Yahara does a lot of instrument integration projects and building command and control software for new instruments. And so in the development process, it can be very helpful to have some sort of simulator of that, because number one, you may not actually have the instrument developed yet. You might know the protocols, the various actions that you're looking to have. You might, have 3D CAD representations of the object, but to be able to hook that in and make that available to software and firmware developers so they can actually sort of anticipate how the instrument is actually going to react to those commands as it's being developed. It can be beneficial to speed up that process, to get it in the hands of more developers to build out various components in parallel and that sort of thing. So this is maybe one example here. Better, James, Josh, any comments on that front?
Well, kind of that, like from the development side too, that's like you don't have to have the physical device, right? Like, so if you have, I don't know, 20 developers spread over the US, it's not like you have to buy 20 instruments for them to like play off of or develop against, or if you're doing I don't know, an upgrade even or anything, they can just work on it without having to ship any of the stuff all around or get like the newest model or anything like that. And then I guess what was the other? Oh, like we're seeing like a visual representation too, but a digital twin doesn't have to be visual. Like you can create a piece of software that behaves and responds like this machine would in like a non-visual space and still kind of interact with it that way from like a programming side, which is really cool.
And I think it's one of the things I really want to point out here is we started doing this without even necessarily naming it or as a a discrete project. Every time we work on a piece of instrumentation, you find that as you're trying to write some piece of software, it's not feasible to go into the laboratory, turn it on, burn through reagents, or
Right.
maybe it's a $500,000 robotics platform and only two of them exist and none of them are available to you.
Mm-hmm.
We have those sorts of instances in the set of instruments that we work on. And so like Josh is saying, the simplest version of this is we'll just replay some files that are coming off the sequencer or replay some commands as you hit against the API. That's a very simple version of it. The more complex versions, as you start to scale up, you can model out all of the motion and put the full interface behind this relatively quickly so that as you are developing against it or interacting with this digital asset that you've now got, it's behaving like the real instrument, but you're not using that robotics platform you don't have access to. So this is a pretty easy way to sort of build up to a level of complexity where you can start to interact with your instrumentation without actually going and touching the instrument.
And I think we've seen, a couple use cases there, that we're in talks with people about. We've explored a little bit in that, that scarce instrument problem, right? So how do I make that available for training, to lab users? Maybe you've got a an instrument that needs, obviously, all instruments may need, periodic maintenance, tuning, calibration, things like that. Maybe they don't happen every day. If you have, some form of, digital twin like this, that's 3D and interactive, we've sort of, we've mocked up something like that as well in more of a, a physical lab space. So like, okay, let's take this into the lab and say, hey, could I, put on a pair of VR goggles and actually go and in virtual environment, like touch this, manipulate the instrument itself, either, through, say like a virtual panel like you see here, or actually like, using touch points on the instrument itself to indicate actions. to train people or give people some like extra context, as to how how they need to operate instrumentation. There's real value there in being able to separate that out from, say, the instruments that you've got working on, real production workflows that maybe you can't pull off. Or if you did, obviously you'd be losing throughput, time on experiments, things of that nature.
And I want to respond to Tad here. He's asked a
What's that
question
say?
in the chat. He's asking, how could we start to see a particular instrument? He's given an example, but a particular instrument interacting in a workflow with multiple. You're starting to see a little bit of that here with sort of the digital representation of a whole laboratory rather than just an instrument. But we don't have mocked up like a full workflow like you're talking about. It is possible, particularly if you have gone ahead and modeled the multiple instruments, 2, 3 instruments in a row that are chaining together to prepare your samples, actually run some analytical measurement on them, and then maybe do some downstream processing and rerun something, or I don't know what. Those kinds of workflows are possible if you set up sort of this, either chained models if you just care about how the data is moving, or actually go ahead and put 3 in a virtual space like this. So you're sort of seeing here Adam modeling out multiple kinds of instruments in the same laboratory. This is the start of how you would do that, right? So Josh, I'd be curious to hear from you, like, where have we gotten most of the benefit out of this? Where have we seen the biggest returns on doing this in our space?
That's a loaded question.
Oh, yes, it
Um,
is. I gave you the easy one.
oh, I don't know, man, because there's a lot of opportunities we've like, or a lot of things you know, we've done in here. Some of it is like with certain tooling, having a digital or a twin that we're leveraging against for, like we've already kind of talked about, like expensive lab equipment that we don't have access to, or that is like in active development. So they're simultaneously creating like the robotic arm and the all the onboard programming for that, and we're computing kind of management software, and so we're kind of get like updating this like digital version that like is so we know and it can interact with that and doing kind of the simultaneous development, which has been cool. But then also with that, we've been able to do some let's call it like virtualized testing. So, when we're developing things, we don't want to sit there for 30 minutes, 2 days, whatever, however long these sequences might be running for, watching our software and being like, oh, how's it doing? What's going on? And but we can use this digital twin and just like let it sit there and run and then kind of come back to it, so we can have these like tests and processes that are running for 2 days in a virtualized space, making sure that any updates we're making aren't going to be crashing a live um, blood sample or something like that. But then before it even gets to like the end production release kind of thing. That's one that we've seen a lot of major use case out of, really. I don't know, do you have another one in mind?
No, I was curious to know where you were going to go with that.
Yeah.
I think the other thing I want to talk about, and Adam started to touch on it a little bit, is sort of the VR or AR aspects of this, of having the ability to start to see the instrument in its environment or over. Oh yeah, here it comes.
For those,
Uh,
these are AR glasses in case can you kind of see the little screens in there? Yeah.
Very stylish.
Yeah, right.
I
Super
was
90s.
Yeah, I was going to ask the two of you, like, let's comment just a little bit about, now we've talked about a fully digital copy of it where I'm modeling it in the video game engine. But let's talk
Hmm.
about it as like overlay with the instrument itself and being able to read through what its status is, or watch the samples that are moving across it, or there's a lot of application here that
Hmm.
I think might surprise folks that, it sounds like science fiction. It's stuff you've seen on TV and you're like, it's just CSI. We can't really do that. Are we sure? Maybe we can.
Man,
We're getting closer, closer and
the
closer.
Minority Report, like,
Yeah, maybe without the dystopian.
yeah, no dystopian themes, but
Well, I mean, so
yeah,
it's interesting because I think you've got kind of two different work streams there, right? I think the VR and the AR have different applications, right?
They
So
do.
when we're talking about really, I think taking the pressure off, say, a live instrument or the development, right?
Mhm.
Like the virtual reality gives you that sort of like interactivity, that sort of additional copyright. I need more of this, and here is a way to get that capability. Versus the AR piece with Josh has been doing some experimentation with, I think now we're talking about augmenting your workflows in the lab. Can
Mhm.
I have more context for experiments that are going on without having to maybe go run over here and look at like, three
Mhm.
different programs, or actually making some of the connections between, different instruments that I might not always, might not have had before. But I think, we've had a lot of conversations, right, both internally and externally, about like the connected lab idea, right? And I think this is one modality where you can really advance that thinking into the future of like, how can I leverage these technologies to give me more as a scientist or an operator than what I have available, just off the shelf from
Mhm.
a
Yeah.
a 5-inch touch screen over here.
Yeah. Well, and it's
Or
interesting
worse,
because there's a
maybe
lot of really,
computer
yeah.
terminal over like in the other room, right?
Yeah. Well, it's kind of cool because like you kind of touched on a little bit like the differences in what maybe their applications are. Like, um, like one we've kind of toyed around with like as a virtual reality representation of a physical machine in like a clean room that you can't access, or maybe it's I don't know, 5 bunkers down and you don't want to walk those stairs. Um, Putting it on and being able to like physically interact with the machine, see the readouts as if you were standing in front of it, and then having that be replicated in the room on the physical machine itself, or like kind of getting that kind of interplay, and that's I don't know, it's just really cool. But then on the augmented reality side, I know one conversation we've had and kind of toyed around with is, if you're under a hood and you're physically doing like research and like splitting samples and like pipetting things and all that, and instead of having to kind of like take your attention away from what you're doing or come out of the hood, if you had these like augmented reality glasses on, so you're seeing the physical, but then you stare at a barcode or an indicator of some point and it just gives you information about that sample. Maybe you're getting maybe you have some other IoT Internet of Things devices that are telling you the humidity, the heat, different things like that, and kind of giving you an awareness of your situation, just all integrated into your workflow. So you don't have to pull yourself out. You can be like stayed in science mode and not in like, oh, what are my notes or what is this or what is that? It's like just all kind of in your awareness.
And I think we're going to continue that theme a little bit here. Tad has asked us one more question, and Tad, we love you for bringing questions to us.
Yeah.
He's asking about, okay, I can observe the workflow, and now could I maybe generate sort of a Gantt chart, showing my workflow and the timings and the interdependencies of how do I move my samples through the lab, or how does this process work, or this chain of
Mhm.
instrumentation? And I think what we've been talking about a little bit is interjecting context into the process. But you
Mhm.
absolutely can use this kind of technology to capture what instrument you are looking at any given time and start to extract context back out. And you can do that with something like the AR goggles and watch it from the scientist's perspective, which might be really useful from a training perspective, right? Imagine doing this with an experienced bench scientist and watching how they move through and using that as your sort of good example, and then watching a junior scientist who does not have this workflow under their fingers yet and may not fully understand how to efficiently move through the laboratory, and being able to compare and contrast those and coach up your junior scientist. So there absolutely is the possibility to pull some of this context back out. But I would also point out, you don't necessarily need the AR goggles to do that. We can put a little webcam in your space, pointing at 2 or 3 different instruments, and extract that kind of context back out and use some
Mhm.
of that in this sort of modeling, reporting, observing, process improvement. How do I improve what's going on in my laboratory? You may be able to
Mhm.
do that for cheap, right? This little webcam that that I'm using here is plenty high enough fidelity
Mhm.
and costs way less than Josh's fancy AR goggles.
Unfortunately. Uh,
Well, for now,
it's interesting
for now.
because right. Well, it's interesting because which thing kind of translates into, I think it's Becky was talking about risk assessment, evaluating contamination risk workflows. And so in like a lab environment, like I think people are doing this, but you could easily have like a digital representation of your lab environment, know that how long this machine takes to do something and this machine and that machine, and kind of like the expected workflow, or like you have that webcam and you're seeing as scientists or people move around the room and around the space what they're doing, and start to kind of create modeling around that, and then have the simulation run where it's like, okay, well, what if I move this machine over here and this machine over here, and like, can you optimize flow? Can you remove risk of people crashing into each other? Can you not open that, clean room, airflow door as much, or are there certain issues along with that, and like kind of optimizing all that space. As for the appetite, I gather you can speak to that. Have you seen a kind of appetite around that sort of thing, or?
We have seen some, and it's usually in, if I can catch an error early in the process. When we're working at a large scale, manufacturing type scenario, if I mess
Mhm.
up in the middle of a run and my quality checks don't come through, I have ended up burning $100,000, $200,000 on that
True.
run, and we have to back up and redo, and I've lost time and reagents
Yeah.
and right.
So
And
the
but
time
but
is a big part
it's
too.
it's big dollar, one mistake costs a lot of money
Hmm.
scenarios, that it starts to be like okay, we really need to find some way to see into this process a little bit more.
Hmm.
I think those sorts of things, it's an easy motivator, right? We've
Hmm.
optimized out a lot of the it's we're okay in terms of human accidents, right? We're not usually optimizing for a lot for that. But there are still
Hmm.
process accidents or quality failures or things that you
Hmm.
could catch a lot earlier in the process that impact your turnaround time or impact your bottom line in some
Yeah.
other way. If there's dollars attached to it, people get
Hmm.
excited about that.
Well,
What's
and
interesting too, go ahead,
well,
Adam.
I mean, I'd like to dig in a little bit more to part of Becky's question there. And by the way, hi Becky, thanks for joining us today. If for those of you that may not have known, Becky joined us for a webinar a couple months ago, maybe at this
Yeah.
point, talking about structuring innovation for success. It was a great webinar. So go back and check that out if you didn't see it. But is the question is that something you've seen an appetite for? And I mean, it's funny because yes, there's like a ton of appetite. There's a ton of interesting conversations, but what we are finding is that, like we kind of alluded to in the beginning of this, I don't know that people know how to get this implemented, right? Or how or
Hmm.
where to start to build these into the processes.
Mhm.
Whereas like other industries, like James, you said like aerospace or other industries that are heavily invested into digital twins. There's more of a technology there. In the lab space, a lot of our conversations are about like, okay, how can we help our partners understand the steps to put in to build towards this? Because yes, these things are possible, and if they were in place, there's real value to that. There's money to be saved.
Hmm.
There's rework that doesn't have to be done. But getting to that isn't always simple as dropping in
Hmm.
just a thing that exists, right? everybody has, you know, some different sets of constraints, different instruments, different workflows. And so part of being able to extract this, you know, this data is just collecting it in the first place, having it in a stream of data that is connected, where we can put, you know, sort of these new innovative technologies on top to be able to react to that, to be able to do the predictive sort of like, ooh, don't do that now because that's the wrong well, or you know, there's some other you know, convoluting factor that would cause problems. So I think, you know, that's part of our part of the reason why we're, you know, kind of doing these webinars, right, talking about this a little bit more and talking about the opportunities and how we can do that, because it can be a longer process, right? It can be a staged process of first like getting organized around your data, and then starting to put some of these, you know, these technologies, digital twins or machine learning or otherwise, into that workflow to really kind of get you to that lab, you know, vision.
And so now it's Becky's turn, and she's brought us one more great question here. I'm just going to read this one out because it sets a lot of great conversation. Becky, you're killing it. When it comes to working in a tightly regulated environment, e.g. CLIA lab, GMP manufacturing, clinical trials, there tends to be a reluctance to trust these powerful new tools. How do you foresee that shifting, and what will need to be proven out along the way to drive more widespread adoption? That's a great question. And I want to lead us out as sort of a response to what Adam was just talking about. It's hard to know where to get started with some of these powerful new tools. And one of the things that we're finding is if they require a massive upfront investment, they're really hard to get started with. The interesting thing on something like these digital twins is they're an integration technology that you can layer over the top of what's already going on without necessarily being disruptive of how your existing laboratory workflow goes. We've got some examples in the virtual demos that Adam's got showing that these models are using the instrument code under the hood. So what the physical instrument is doing and what the digital instrument is doing mirror each other. That mirroring, that overlay capability, that you can make one drive the other or see them operate, you know, sort of side by side, means that you can leave your existing laboratory space in place, run your workflows just like you do today, so you are not disrupting your regulated workflow, and start to get some of the value back out of it as a relatively quick overlay on top of what your existing process is. Now the technology's in your environment, and you can start to think about, can I incorporate it into my workflow? Can I use this to optimize or change or improve or quality check my workflow? That's amazing. And it's an opportunity that isn't there if you never get the software into your space.
As I said, covers it. At least my thoughts on it too. Yeah.
I'll take more if you've got them. No?
Kind of thinking from in general, just I mean, if you generalize it a little bit, because I mean, I don't think it's just digital twins, but just advanced computing and machine processes, and you know, a little bit of the taking the human out of it, nature of these things. You know, it's from like a regulatory perspective. It's going to take time and essentially like double proofing. Like you let the machine do it, and then you do it your old way, and you see like time savings, cost savings, more effective. Like you're not going to probably have somebody sitting in a lab 24/7 watching everything that's going on, but you can have a computer do that. So you might be able to get tighter, you know, regulatory clarity around your processes just by that, versus having or maybe taking the boring bits out so the human doesn't have to sit there forever, but the machine can do it and then give you like an output or like a synopsis of everything, and then the human can do the human stuff. So like kind of working in tandem. But I really think it's probably more about efficiency and like better outcomes than it's going to be about a full replacement, especially at the start. But those are my two cents on that one. So
Adam, any extra thoughts from you?
Well, I mean, I think it's, how do you chip away over that time, right? Proving the
Right.
technology is out, right? Can these types of enhancements to workflows sort of like, slowly replace the sort of four eyes, workflow of like, validation of a process, and using these to prove, look, the simulations or the monitoring of activities that are going on produces better outcomes, and using that data as drivers to move these into more regulated environments, processes. Change takes time.
Yeah, I like Tad's next question. It's loaded.
Go with it.
I don't know if you've Ted and sorry, text moved on me. Ted, another one talking about we mentioned recognizing errors in workflows and equipment that already exists. Massive value in virtually binding your automated workflows and determining if it works before actually buying it. Vendors say it will work, but will it? That's super loaded, because I think that that's a it depends sort of situation. Like places where I could see it working. One example. So if you did like an augmented reality version, if you're trying to add a new instrument to your lab and you're worried about space, or you're worried about interrupting other workflows or anything like that, if you could virtualize that inside of your environment itself and place it where you want to do and have it do its thing, like maybe it's got a big old like spinning arm or something like that you're worried about. Being able to physically place it in your lab and see how it would affect your workflow and how it would affect people's flow around the lab, things like that. And then kind of from the digital side, if it was made in such a way where you could, kind of what Adam was showing, where we could interact with it digitally, find it kind of from outside, feed it an input, get its output. You could take that and kind of work it into your process and use a dummied sort of data set to see, like, can I get this into my flow? Will the data go? Will it do what I want? Can I get the data out I'm expecting? Things like that. On the other side of thing, if you're trying to do something where you're taking a physical material and running it through a process and trying to determine the output at the end of it, through like chemical interactions and things like that. And then you're going to try to tweak it and add a different chemical and see if it changes. Stuff like that is really hard to do in the digital space, because the amount of data that you need in order to even predict that is a lot. And there's a lot we don't know about, even like chemical reactions in the physical, like that's where a lot of study goes on, right? And so eventually, if we had a data set that was big enough, you could start to predict that kind of thing and see if it's a certain instrument's going to do what you want it to do to physical media. But I think more on the process and the generalized data inputs, outputs, physical space interaction, things like that, you're going to get a lot more bang for your buck before you buy it. I don't know. Other thoughts from people on that one, or?
No, I think that's a really good answer, is the physical interactions, and can I interface these instruments, and if I put them next to each other, do they align? Can I set up my automations and get close before I buy the instruments, before I install them into my physical space? Can I model it out and see whether we're even in the ballpark? And the answer is
or even
yes.
training too,
Or in training, right? So these are great applications for some of the more, we'll do the full up video game engine model. You can see the physical thing and interact with it in sort of that VR space. So that's the very physical side of it. What Josh is talking about on the data side, We haven't done a lot of work of trying to generate novel data off of one of those where you would predict what it would do. Instead, typically what we're doing in that scenario is replaying the data off of it. So you've
Mhm.
already run that sample at some point in the past. You know what the output is supposed to be and when it's supposed to arrive. And you can use that to model I need my limb system to pick up these files, or I need this data to flow over to my data lake and lay out in this particular way, or I need this machine learning model to kick in and do the next step, right? So those sorts of things, it's not so much that we are modeling how you would create the data, but we do model often what it looks like for it to come off of the instrument when you already
Mhm.
have the data. So if you can use it in more of a replay scenario in those, and that does help in developing sort of how am I going to move my data through the process. We've been talking
Mhm.
physical and samples and interactions in the laboratory. The dry lab side of it is almost as hard to do, and if you can start from a sane data set and work that through the process, now it's much easier to develop the software against it.
Mhm.
It all comes down to scope again, right? So, what is the magnitude of the problem, and how quickly can, a solution be developed to address it? Um, whether it's data, whether it's, physical manipulations of samples, or, I think like the R&D processes, that are really leveraging digital twins now in some other industries. I mean, they are very geared towards, if not, this, the particulars of Tad's question, like that the same general problem of can I run maybe Monte Carlo simulations over different different configurations, or different workflows, or to get an optimized solution to some problem, and using a digital twin to do that, is
Mhm.
absolutely viable, solution in some capacity. And whether it's the single instrument, we're working on a project now where we have some optimization that needs to happen, right? There's complex instrument, many moving parts, large plates and fields within those, optimizing a workflow to get through the various steps efficiently across all wells and all plates. It could be
Mhm.
critical to success of some of these processes. And so, like, those types of problems could very well be targets for these types of solutions that we'd like to see more adoption of. And again, it kind of goes back to, I think, one thing that strikes me a little bit with the multi-instrument integrations, the multi, node processes, there's the end by end problem, right? So many different instrument manufacturers, so many different workflows and labs, and putting that all together in disparate data sources. I think we recently got back from the lab manager conference. There's a good talk there about uh, some industry standardization of like how data is output, how it's stored, some consistent formats. And I think the industry probably needs to see a little bit more adoption of that to make some of these even more accessible. And hopefully that's something that comes in the future here. But I think that's one of the ways, or one of the reasons where I think having a good foundation for sort of data storage, experimentation results, how you're staging that in the lab, if you really are looking to become a you know an innovative lab of the future. I mean, it all comes back down to that data. It's something we've been kind of consistently talking about in all of the webinars that we've done. It always just comes back to this, like, how good is your data, how accessible is it, how well is it stored, and what's the path to getting there, to enable these things.
And I want to point out that this goes back to sort of the how do we adopt some of these technologies. It becomes easier to adopt the technologies when they are helping you to stage the data the right way, when they are helping you to drive through the automations and the integrations. And if you are taking advantage of the advanced technology to move your data landscape forward, it becomes easier to integrate the next piece of technology, easier to start to support the laboratorians, the people that need to interact with the data downstream, and get more of the business value back out of it. So one of the things that we want you to really hear from this is we are hopeful that the classes of technology we're talking about are really going to start to help you to standardize, to get your integrations right, to get you to a place where you have the better data foundations.
A couple other, comments, question here, in the chat. And by the way, thanks everybody. Like, this has been like a great
We love the
interactive
interactive stuff. It's amazing.
session. But Garrett posted, can we use digital twins to model scenarios, to optimize? We talked about that a little bit, but one of the things, we've got about 10 minutes, I think, before we'll need to wrap, talking about sort of like what that future is, even beyond some of the things that we're talking about. Everything we've been talking about so far is like, really, I think it's just a matter of putting the pieces in place to do it. But I think there's sort of like the next step removed. James, in your ideal world, how would you see maybe all of these technologies coming together to really take it to that next level?
So I want to see it supporting it was the partial answer from last time. I want to see the technology supporting getting to the better integrations and the better data coming out of the process. The technology needs to be enabling that. And then layering on top of that, the process improvements, the added context, anything that I can do to minimize the mistakes or maximize the throughput of what goes on in the laboratory, or better support the laboratorian in training and how to do this right or interact with this new instrument that I'm bringing into their space. All of those are things that change how I do my business, or they're things that improve the quality of the science that is getting done. And those have to be sort of the bottom line goals. If it's just cool, shiny new tech, I want to play with it, but it's hard to spend money to actually get it set up. If it is improving the quality of your data, or it's improving the process of your laboratorian, then all of a sudden it's easier to take the time, take the effort, do the work to get the technology into place. And what I think we really want to see out of this is, as we improve process, it opens up the possibility to really innovate. And it's hard to say what that looks like. Again, sort of, I started with, we're in such a disparate space. We're all laboratorians, we do similar things, and then we have wildly different outputs from whatever our organization is. The similarities are the places where you want to focus and capture that. And those differences, that's sort of the end by end problem that Adam's mentioning. How do I model out every possible instrument that could ever possibly interact? You don't, at least not up front. But you start somewhere, and then you build up chains of common instruments, and you get to a place where you can start to see the digital outputs of the laboratory, the digital processes of the laboratory, and drive the better compliance or the better data out of it. And now I can start to do something innovative instead of just interesting.
So what about, I've got, I think we've talked about, at least some of these things tangentially, but I have my instruments. Maybe I have a digital twin of, one or two key instruments. We're watching that data flow, coming in. We're capturing other modalities of data. So we have the cameras, sitting around the labs. We have the microphones. You can talk to the thing. You can interact in different ways, but then through like integrating things like machine learning on top of those data streams, right? Getting insights back from your digital twin, on operational efficiencies. That's low hanging fruit, but actually maybe looking at, the output of your results data, right?
Mhm.
And having the context of the experiment in flight and putting that all together and giving you insights about, well, this didn't turn out the way you thought it was. Maybe it's because X, Y, and Z. Maybe try this next time, right? How can we see these technologies really, revolutionizing the science itself, right? And that's all. I mean, that seems kind of wild, but yet I don't think it's that far in the future, right?
And this is so Josh and I've had some of this conversation in the background. Josh, I
Mhm.
want you to jump in and comment about context. Why does it matter that I can see data of different modalities, as Adam's describing it? See into the
Yeah.
problem from multiple directions.
Oh, I mean, where I guess I'd dive into that question is there's a lot of, I mean, context is really king in a lot of this stuff. Like, if you're only seeing from one angle, you're gonna, you're only gonna be able to understand so much about your problem or so much about what's going on, right? And so the more data that you can really like pull out of something, whether it's I don't know, you fed a sample and then it did something. You're like, oh, cool, I fed it this can't even think of the right science term right now. Sorry, this food, um, and it did X, Y, Z. It's like, well, if you give that to somebody else in a slightly different environment, whether heat, humidity, sun, time of day, I don't know, phase of the moon, and then they try to duplicate it and it doesn't do what you'd expect it to do. It's like, okay, well, what's missing, right? Like you don't have the data to capture to kind of understand why something is different. But say you've got this process you're running through in your lab and you're getting this all in stream and you now have this bank of knowledge from previous run samples. You can kind of feed that in maybe through your digital twin and have an expected outcome. And then see in the physical space, did it actually do that? What was different? And maybe catching things in flight through that, like we talked about the manufacturing process, but maybe that's part of you're doing some blood cultures or something and you see that, oh, something's different here, and you can get kind of early warning signs. Maybe you can adapt so you can maybe it's producing less than you would have expected, but you can kind of tweak the process so at the end result you're still getting everything you want. But all of that kind of requires all of this data coming in from different vectors and something or someone sitting there analyzing it as it's coming through in real time almost, um, in order to get that sort of responsiveness in process or in workflow, I guess, right? Um, and I guess the other caveat, the other thing that's kind of really cool is you may like a trained tool can process things really, really fast. Like a machine can go really, really fast, and it's good at processing data that's the same or close to the same, and it doesn't get bored. And it might get lazy, but it doesn't get bored. Um, and it might start to discover similarities or differences that are occurring in your process, that a human may not have thought to think about, if that makes like it's not like the machine's having inspiration, but like it's seeing a pattern that maybe a human is too distracted to see, which could provide insight into optimization or even maybe something wrong with your process, something right with your process, something you can leverage. You know, yeah, I don't know.
And
I love
I
context. Yeah.
I want to follow that and say this is the opportunity for real innovation. As you can add context back in and learn from it. So this is machine learning, artificial intelligence, and also training and support for your laboratorians. Get the humans involved in this process too.
Mhm.
But anywhere where I can close the loop and start to feed things I have learned back into my current process, anywhere that feedback can start to happen, you can get real innovation out of it. Those
Mhm.
closed loop opportunities are hard to see in these big, long, pipelined, complex processes. And until you've got them modeled out, it's hard to know how you're going to close the loop. we're standing right on the edge of knowing how to do it, how to inject that context back into your process. Adam, I think you get last word here. Close us out with some thoughts, and then we need to thank everyone and give them back maybe 1 minute of their time.
Well, I mean, I guess I'd say, you know, I think we do know how to do it, right? I think we know how to pull it all together. I think it's, you know, your kind of catchphrase of doing the work, right? We've got you've got to do the work to put the pieces in place. Yeah, I think that's, you know, one of our, you know, core tenants missions with working with people is, you know, how do we sort of get those pieces in place so that we can enable, you know, some of these workflows and these capabilities. You know, how can we sort of like reduce the complexity that's out there right now to make it achievable you know, to be able to solve these problems, and you know, I think we're all here pretty hopeful and bullish that it's, you know, it's right next door, you know, not far.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess you know, to everybody that that came to join us today, thanks a ton for coming out and hanging out. Really appreciate the questions. Uh, you know, from everybody, and obviously Josh, James, myself, we all love to love to talk about this. If you've got questions, thoughts, you know, want to get on a chat and talk more, you know, our contact information is up there. You know, we're excited to have you all here.